Alright everybody, I'm Chad Muntinu and I'm going to give you my predictions for UFC 114, Rampage versus Rashad Evans. Now, this fight has been hyped up for a long time with the Ultimate Fighter and everything, but I'm really glad that it's happening finally. It was supposed to happen back at UFC 107 in Memphis, which is Rampage's hometown, but obviously the A-Team kind of derailed that whole thing, but I'm glad it's happening now. Now, onto the actual prediction. I think Rampage Jackson is going to win, and he's going to win by KO. But it does depend on who shows up. Is it going to be B.A. Baracus or Quentin Rampage Jackson? Because if B.A. Baracus shows up, Rampage was fat, he's going to be sluggish, he's obviously not going to be able to deal with the wrestling game that Rashad brings, and he's going to have ring rust if he's not trained to take on Rashad. I, however, don't think that Rampage is underestimating Rashad. I think Rampage is that prideful of a guy. And when you're that prideful of a guy and you talk that much shit, you have to back it up. You can't let it slide. You know what I mean, guys? And I think that while Rashad brings in a great wrestling base, he's obviously a very quick striker, especially in comparison to Rampage. I do think that Rampage is, without a doubt, the better striker. And his wrestling base isn't bad. He's a sprawl and brawl fighter. He's always been a sprawl and brawl fighter. His wrestling is tailor-made for MMA since that's what it got bred in, which is with pride and those vicious slams. And he has said since the Keith Jardine fight that he wants to return to those wrestling roots. And I think he knows, especially after watching the Thiago Silva fight and Rashad's resurgence as a wrestler, that he's going to have to bring back those wrestling roots. And I think that he will beat Rashad decisively using those wrestling roots. Well, not using the wrestling roots, but just stuffing takedowns and then just knocking the shit out of Rashad. Because Rashad, he's never really been hit. He has a bit of a glass jaw, as seen by, Lyoto Machida. And Rampage has really only been knocked out by knees, and soccer kicks. But, those aren't legal anymore, so we're not going to talk about them. The next fight I'm going to look at is Dan Loazon versus Efren Esquerdo. And I think Efren will take this. I like Efren. I've been watching him since The Ultimate Fighter. I'm a fan. Dan Loazon's no slouch, but Efren is Efren. And he had a tough loss last time, but I think he'll come out hungry. He's that type of fighter. He has that pride, he has that swagger. He's going to come back and he's going to want to finish. I don't think he'll finish, though, because he's still fundamentally a wrestler at heart. He's still a little bit one-dimensional. So I think he'll come out, he'll out-wrestle Dan Loazon, he'll avoid submissions, he'll do some ground and pound, and either he'll get the TKO or he'll walk away with the unanimous decision. The next fight will be Todd Duffy versus Mike Rousseau. Todd Duffy exploded onto the scene, and a lot of the more ignorant fans rank him as high as, they consider him a threat to Lesnar at this moment. The reason why I'm not on the Todd Duffy bandwagon just yet is that he has shown that he's a little bit of a devastating striker. He's got power in his hands, it's almost Shane Carwin-esque. However, unlike Shane Carwin, he doesn't have that wrestling base, from my knowledge, and he's a little bit unexplored. He's a little bit one-dimensional, and he doesn't have that skill. He hasn't fought skilled people. Mike Rousseau's record isn't that much better, but don't be sold on Todd Duffy being the Terminator and just wrecking through people. He still needs to be tested. I'm going to go with Duffy, though, because I think the UFC is trying to build him up and have him be almost like a big-ass white Paul Daly, really, and just build up this phenomenal striker to fight Brock and everything. But I do think if Todd Duffy wants to be champion, he needs to work on his wrestling, and maybe he can showcase that more in this fight. I haven't really seen much of him because his last fight was only 6 seconds, so hopefully he's a little bit better. The next fight I'm seeing is Diego Sanchez versus John Hathaway. John Hathaway's undefeated, but Diego Sanchez is Diego Sanchez. I think Diego is one of those fighters who, if he decides on the division and he stuck to it, he would be one of the greatest in that division, and I fundamentally stick by that. I think in welterweight he was top 5. The only people who really took it to him were Josh Koscheck and John Fitch, but I think and those guys are obviously John Fitch beating everybody who's not named GSP, and Josh Koscheck fighting GSP next. Those guys aren't any slouches, and I think what Diego needs to work on is refining his stand-up, and I think John Hathaway is a perfect test dummy for Diego to work that stand-up game. Antonio Nogueira versus Jason Brills. Now, Rogerio, otherwise known as Lil Nog, is a beast. Some people rank him as high as number 5 in the division. A lot of people are already heralding him to fight Shogun next. The fight against Forrest Griffin would have set up that Shogun fight. However, Jason Brills is nowhere near top tier 205 pounds. I've never even heard of that guy. He does have an okay record. His record is pretty decent. It's around the same level as Nog. They have the same amount of fights. But Nogueira's Nogueira. He has that submission game. His stand-up is amazing, and he should come out and he should win and win decisively. Anything less will be a disappointment and a failure for Nogueira. The next fight that I see is Jesse Forbes versus Ryan Jensen. I don't really know about either of those guys. I'm a little bit ignorant of them. So I'm gonna go with Ryan Jensen because he seems to be more experienced. He has more fights. He's a little bit older. Jesse Forbes seems to be that young buck. But that fight can go either way as far as I'm concerned. If any of you are more knowledgeable about those guys, I would love to hear that knowledge, and you guys share it with me because I really want to be informed when I go watch these fights. Lewis Kane versus Cyril Diabate. I think Lewis Kane is a beast. He trains with Thiago Silva. He's a beast. His loss recently was to Rogerio, and if you're ranking Rogerio as high as number 5, a loss to Rogerio is nothing. It's nothing to slouch. I think Lewis Kane is borderline top 10, and I think he has that level of skill. I think he's around Thiago level. They train together, and I think Lewis Kane should win decisively as well. Melvin Gillard versus Thiago Tavares. From what I know about Tavares, he's a pretty good grappler, and from what I know about Melvin Gillard, he's not a good grappler. But Melvin Gillard has that power. He has that slickness. He's the only guy I've ever seen to knock out a guy with a body punch. And once you see something as magical as that, you don't bet against that guy. So I'm gonna go with Melvin Gillard. Mike Guillemon versus Yoshiyuki Yoshida. I'm going to go with Mike Guillemon, mostly because Japanese fighters have had a hard time adapting to Western MMA, and that's for a number of reasons. It's mostly because they don't believe in cutting weight, and it's so prevalent. You have Brock Lesnar coming down from 280, you have GSP coming down from 190, Thiago Alves coming down from like 225, according to him, and so they're most often undersized. And if you have any sort of wrestling background and you can impose your will on Yoshiyuki Yoshida or on any Japanese fighter, you will often win, we saw that with Aoki versus Melendez. Amir Sadala versus Don Kim. On paper, this doesn't look like a good fight for Amir, but I think Amir's going to come out, and I think Amir's going to show the world why we fell in love with him, because he's a tenacious, good fighter with a heart of gold, pretty much. Don Kim is undefeated. Amir is 3-1, but Doppage isn't, nothing to cry home about. He's undefeated currently. And I think if Amir beats Don Kim, he comes into that mid-tier welterweight fighters, and the welterweight division is extremely stacked. It's wonderful. I would rank that as the second most stacked division in the UFC at the moment, just behind light heavyweight. Aaron Riley versus Joe Bramer. Aaron Riley is a good fighter. He didn't look too good against Ross Pearson, but he's still a good fighter. Joe Bramer, I don't really know much about him, but he's young. He doesn't have that many losses on his record. We'll see how Aaron Riley comes out, but I think Aaron Riley, this is going to be a step-up bout for him, and I think he'll win. Finally, we got everybody's favorite Brit, Michael Bisping versus Dan Miller. People give Bisping a lot of shit because they say that he's a poster boy for UK MMA, that he's been fed cans to make him seem like this great guy, and I do agree with that. Everybody Bisping's fought that is good, he's lost to, but he's never lost quite as bad as he could have been. Dan Henderson, he got knocked the fuck out, but that was more bad game planning on his part than anything else. And he fought well against Vanderlei. I can't fault anybody for fighting that war against Vanderlei, because Vanderlei, you say he's washed up, you say he's his abysmal record in the UFC, but Vanderlei brings it every time. So a loss against Vanderlei is nothing bad to me. And Bisping is solidly middle tier. He's dancing around the top 10. I would say he's top 15 in middleweight. And Dan Miller is Dan Miller. Dan Miller's pretty good too, but I don't think Dan Miller's near Bisping's level, and I think Bisping will win. And then he'll be fed another top level guy and lose, which is unfortunate, but that's the way the cookie crumbles. Either way, this is a good night of fights. It's my first video predicting fights, so wish me luck, give me some tips on how to improve, but hopefully everything turns out good. I'm Chad Munstner, and I'll see you later.